We have some potentially huge news here on the election. Apparently, Mitt Romney is considering an endorsement of the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson. Now, most of you are like, hold on now, Kyle, don't you mock Mitt Romney every time you mention him and call him the human Ken doll and say he has zero appeal and zero charisma? That is all true. But remember that Gary Johnson is polling at about 9%, 9 in some polls, about 12% in other polls, and he would need to get to 15% in order to get into the debates. And if he gets into the debates, well, then it's, this is a whole new game we're talking about. Because you think back to when Ross Perot ran in the 90s, and Ross Perot, of course, he's a billionaire and he was an independent, but he was massively against free trade deals. He was against NAFTA, and he went in there and he explained what NAFTA would do. This was before NAFTA was implemented, but he would explain, this is what's going to happen. You're going to hear a giant sucking sound from Mexico, and that's going to be the sound of the vacuum taking our jobs over there. I'm Ross Perot. He was right. There were a lot of things about Ross Perot I didn't agree with, but he was right about that. And Ross Perot was the most successful independent candidate in U.S. history. Now, it's actually even more interesting for Gary Johnson because Gary Johnson's going to be on the ballot in all 50 states as the Libertarian. So if he's on the ballot in all 50 states and he gets into the first debate and he does well enough to hold on to then be in the second debate and the third debate and he starts getting much more media attention, well, then you opened up this race. But there's another interesting fact. The Koch brothers have said, we're not considering Trump. It's over, even though Trump picked Mike Pence for VP, and Mike Pence is somebody who the Kochs have previously given a lot of money to. I mean, that was the whole idea. Trump picks this establishment guy, and he's thinking like, okay, now I'll get the money so I could sell out, more to these big money interests. Well, the Kochs just said, no, we're not interested in that. And then they were asked, okay, but will you run, for example, like anti-Hillary ads? They're like, no. Okay, well then will you maybe fund Hillary? Are you going to back Hillary? They're like, no. So they're not going to focus on that. They do say, hey, we're going to focus on Senate races. But if they decide, and they can, there's nothing stopping them, they call themselves libertarians. So if they decide, Gary Johnson, he's a libertarian. We might not agree with him on everything, but he was the governor of New Mexico. It's not like this guy is a third-party candidate who's a total and utter outsider. He's just not. He's already been involved in politics. There are recent stories about how he's said, on TPP, I could be with the establishment on that one, you know what I'm saying? So, and in other ways, Gary Johnson is great and better than Hillary and Trump, and in other ways he's not. But it's possible the Kochs say, fuck it. We're going to pick this guy. We're going to give money to his campaign. And then it's also possible that other high-profile Republicans other than Mitt Romney endorse him. And remember, guys, all that has to happen is enough high-profile people back him to bump him up from 9% or 12% to 15%. If you get him to 15%, he's in the first debate. So that can happen. And then again, all you need is a few big money donors, and there are many big money Republican donors who have said, I'm going to sit out this election, or I'm only going to fund Senate races, or some neocons, for example, have even flipped to Hillary because she's sufficiently hawkish for their tastes. So it's possible to have the groundwork and the framework set up to make it so that Gary Johnson makes a dent on this election. And then there's the really far-fetched scenario of if Gary Johnson gets in the debates and he does well and people are so sick of Trump and Hillary that they're like, okay, I'll go for this guy. He just seems like a regular guy. Well, what can happen is, in the general, if nobody gets to 270 electoral votes, then the House of Representatives has to decide who's going to be president. Now, in that situation, Hillary's out because, remember, she's a Democrat and the House is overwhelmingly Republican. But then the House, many of them in the House are also like, Trump. So then it would honestly be between Gary Johnson and Donald Trump. And they would have to pick one of them. And I don't know who they'd pick. I mean, honestly, my gut reaction would be, they're going to pick Trump. They would pick Trump. But you never know. You never know. I mean, there's so many moneyed interests behind the scenes and elites, wealthy donors, who fear Trump because, not only because he's a crazy person, which is true, but also because they don't know if they can control him. Because he really is a loose cannon, and they don't know, okay, here's the money I'm going to give you, now you need to do X for me. No. So they might put immense pressure on the House to pick Gary Johnson in that scenario. Again, this is a very far-fetched scenario, but we're just shooting the shit here. They might lean in Gary Johnson's direction in that scenario, and then next thing you know, there's a President Johnson, and he would be in office with the fewest number of electoral votes in U.S. history. The fewest number of, actually I should say, well, electoral, but also popular votes in U.S. history. Wow, what a weird election. And then there's another added benefit of that. So if Gary Johnson can get into the debates, get some high-profile endorsements, get some money, get into the debates, well, then also you open up the door to progressives and liberals can go all in for Jill Stein. Because you just made it a three-way race, and in a three-way race between Trump, Johnson, and Hillary, what happens? More likely than not, the right-wing vote is split more so than the left-wing vote is. So when you split the right-wing vote and the left-wing vote is more unified, though obviously not totally unified, but more unified than the right-wing vote, well, then that would mean President Hillary Clinton. And that's where I go full, let's fucking get Jill Stein in there. Now, I'm already voting for Jill Stein, as I've said a million times, but I've also added the caveat that, well, I'm doing that because I live in New York. I've said repeatedly, if I lived in Ohio or Florida or anything that could conceivably be a swing state, I would hold my nose and vomit and shit myself and cry myself to sleep for a month and a half, but I would vote for Hillary Clinton because I think Trump is genuinely a danger to the republic. I think Hillary's business as usual, or if anything, a little further to the right on the spectrum than Obama is. I think Donald Trump is such a wild card that, and I can't trust that guy with nukes, I can't trust that guy with an army, that I would vote for Hillary if I was in a swing state. But if Gary Johnson gets involved in the race, and if Gary Johnson gets to the first debate, and if Gary Johnson gets some funding, and if he's gaining some traction, and if he's polling at 16, 17, 18% in the polls, I'm going balls to the wall for Jill Stein. And in that scenario, I'd say, no, I'd vote for Jill Stein whether it's swing states. I'd vote for Jill Stein whether it's solidly red or blue states. I'd just vote for Jill Stein, period. So, but that's just my little thing on it and what I would do. But either way, this is a really, really interesting case that we're presented with here. Because Mitt Romney, I wouldn't put it past Mitt Romney to say, you know what, Gary Johnson. I wouldn't put it past him. And then there's also a question as to whether or not they're pushing Gary Johnson because they want to split the Trump vote and see Hillary win, or if they're pushing Gary Johnson because they really think they could maybe mount enough of a charge where he wins in that far-fetched scenario I laid out. I don't know. But either way, it's fucking fascinating. You already had some members of the Bush family endorse Gary Johnson. Not George W. Bush, not George H.W. Bush, but people in the family. So, and remember, George H.W. Bush and W. Bush have not endorsed Trump, and they didn't show up to the convention. So Mitt Romney and some members of the Bush family endorsing Gary Johnson, that would change the dynamics of the race in a way that's unprecedented in U.S. history. And it's really exciting to see how that would unfold, if indeed it does unfold. So let's sit back and watch. It's also possible that nothing happens. Nobody ends up endorsing Gary Johnson. Nobody ends up giving him big money donations. And we're right back to Trump or Hillary. Let's all cry together. So we'll see. We'll see here. But this is absolutely fascinating.